Hello, podcast listener. This is your host with the most, JJ. I want to meet every single person in the world. That's why the podcast is called JJ Meets World. We have a previous guest on with us, but we're talking about a subject that has been just huge over the last year. And I think a lot of people have really enjoyed the first episode of the JJ Meets World book club. Here is a second one. Plus, Tucker and I are going to talk about breakfast foods and mixing cereals. All of this and so much more on today's episode of JJ Meets World. And by the way, if you'd like to help support our podcast, visit jjmeetsworld.com where you can donate to our Patreon, pick up some killer swag at our merch shop, or click the link to Apple Podcast and give us a 5-star review.
1, 2, 3, 4. J.J. Gordon, sort of like that Indiana Jones, in that he's always sniffing out his next adventure. Yes, he is. He's always interviewing guests so he can have them on his show and they can talk about pop culture, arts, and leisure. J.J. has his flag unfurled and he likes his french fries curled, and he's fun and then he twirls as he goes to meet the world. He will march into the rain even if his ankle sprained. Take a peek inside his brain. This podcast is called J.J. Meets World.
I don't know why people have such a big problem with me eating spaghetti for breakfast. It seems like if it's good enough for dinner, it's good enough for breakfast. I'm a human being who, if I'm going to tell you this, breakfast is my least favorite meal of the day because I feel like it's very limited. Like you have very few options when it comes to breakfast food. But when it comes to lunch and dinner, you can do anything, including have those foods that have been labeled as breakfast foods. And so I find myself more often than not eating leftovers for breakfast, as I did today. I ate a bunch of spaghetti for breakfast. So stop judging me, you judgy McJudgersons who are out there thinking like, what's that dude eating 3 hamburger patties for lunch? And I'm like, you know what? Because they're going to go bad and someone's got to eat them.
It's
Tucker,
like a
I know
hamburger
that
patty
you
sandwich
have
between hamburger patties.
you are on you're on a journey of culinary fulfillment. And how do you feel about breakfast as a meal?
Oh, I'm a massive fan of the foods that are considered breakfast foods. I don't typically eat breakfast right away in the morning because usually my stomach is just not settled enough for it. So my morning is typically just coffee and water. And then once my tummy is settled, I might have breakfast food, but at lunch or dinner. So I love me some, eggs, bacon, pancakes, waffles, toast, hash browns. Oh man, that is a meal I think ready for any time of day. But I'm also really into cereal again right now, actually. So once we're done with this recording, my next plan is to pour myself a nice bowl of frosted mini wheats.
Frosted mini wheats is the choice, huh? Do you let them sit in the milk for a little bit, or do you you want crunch?
No. I love that crunch, and my top 2 breakfast cereals are Golden Grahams and Frosted Mini Wheats. So I've got boxes of both those, but I think I'm gonna up my fiber intake today a little bit. Yeah.
Are you ever put those 2 cereals together in the same bowl, pour some milk over it?
My goodness, I have never even considered that as a possibility, JJ. But that's you know what? You're sick. You are a sick man. And I love it.
So I love Frosted Flakes. I'm a Frosted Flakes guy, but I also enjoy, not a lot, but every now and then, a bowl of Fruity Pebbles. And I mixed Fruity Pebbles and Frosted Flakes together one day, and I thought, oh my God, I've created something in my own image.
Do you like Raisin Bran?
I do like Raisin Bran.
I'm a big old Raisin Bran person as well. That'd be my third.
Do you like the 2 scoops of raisins?
Love the 2 scoops of raisins. Sometimes I'll add more raisins and I'll even drizzle honey on top.
Okay, I was going to say, JJ Gordon pro tip. I eat Honey Nut Cheerios, but drizzle honey on my Honey Nut Cheerios, which makes for a really delightful breakfast snack.
Have you ever eaten just a bowl of blueberries and cream or milk for breakfast?
No, but I have put warmed up blueberries on my Rice Krispies.
I'd recommend giving this a shot sometimes. I can't remember who told me to try this. But you just take blueberries, just pour them in a bowl like cereal. I was told to use cream the first time, which might be a little too intense for someone, but you can definitely use the milk of your choice. And you could even sprinkle a little bit of sugar on top because the blueberries are more tart than they are necessarily just sweet. And the sugar kind of helps just round out the flavor a bit more. It's pretty damn good, dude.
Oh, in fact, I'm getting hungry now just talking about it. So let me pour a little sugar in your ears, everybody. This episode.
You know how deeply uncomfortable that would be? Like, oh, God, I got all the sugar in my ears. This is not where it's supposed to go.
Wait until the ants show up. Our episode today is the second JJ Meets World book club episode. Kevin Kennedy, a previous guest on the show, is with us, and we talk books, and we don't just talk like, hey, here's a great book you could read. We talk about authors. We talk about education and the role that books play in that. We go nostalgia based, and then we talk about Bill Murray movies for a little bit because why not? This episode, a ton of fun. Make sure that you've got the notes section of your phone or a piece of paper and a writing utensil in front of you because you're going to be jotting down some notes. Even during this episode, I was on Amazon looking to purchase some books while we were talking. So I think that it'll definitely get that reader in you going. So get that sugar out of your ears and enjoy this episode of JJ Meets World.
JJ Meets World.
It's the JJ Meets World Book Club, our second edition of this with Kevin Kennedy, a recurring guest on JJ Meets World. Kevin called me and was super, super angry that we hadn't involved him in the first book club episode. And so I felt like we had to do a second one and make sure that he was a guest. Kevin, how are you this morning?
I'm doing great. And I was surprised how many books we had in common, but I loved that podcast. And I called you like immediately after I listened to it.
Yeah, I'm glad. I mean, it's good to know that you're still listening. And that's why I invited you to be a guest again, because if I can just invite listeners to be regular guests, I know I can keep my numbers up.
There you go.
So before we get into the recommendations that we have for this second book club edition podcast, I want to talk about a little bit about how authors have made an impression on you in your life. Now, for a profession, you're an educator, and theater is a big part of that. But English is also a part of your life, and certainly reading has become a passion for you over the years.
Yes, that is absolutely true. My high school English teacher, Mr. Wadley, yes, he had a weird name. He used to have a Christmas party every year and invite students. I went to a Catholic school. It was a little bit different back in the 80s. And he'd have a Christmas party every year. And I remember going to his house, and he had floor-to-ceiling bookshelves all the way around. And I remember thinking, God, I want that. That looks so cool. And I've never turned back. And that was 35 years ago. So
one of the things that you told me, also full disclosure, Kevin and I were supposed to get together for a short meeting a week ago that turned into 7 hours.
7 hours.
Because we're two guys who just like to talk. And also, I feel like we're people who need people. And so when you meet up with another person who needs people, oh, man, it is just wonderful.
When you're planning for an hour, figuring it'll be 2 hours, and then you said, well, you've been here for 7.5 hours. I looked at my watch and I was like, oh my God, I have.
Right. Yeah. I didn't get any of the things done I was supposed to get done. But did you feel like that filled your cup?
Oh,
you know, like you needed that. I know I needed it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So one of the stories you told me was one of the books that I've been recommending to people this last year because I loved it so much. Going back to it, I read it first when I was in 4th or 5th grade, was Hatchet by Gary Paulsen. And you told me that you had gone to an event where Gary Paulsen was present. And so you actually were able to get like a signed copy of one of his books, and he had a kind of a fun wink and a nod to you. Would you mind telling that story?
Yeah, let me give you some backstory on Gary Paulsen that was interesting to me. I enrolled in grad school in 1998 or 99, somewhere in there. And my very first day of my very first class, my teacher, Chris Gordon, was talking about books. And this is before the internet became as big as it is. And she said, have you read the book Hatchet? And I'd never heard of it. And like 3 hands went up in the class of 20. And And she said, well, it's by Gary Paulsen. And she goes, if you haven't read it, you need to drop what you're doing and read it. And I literally went from her class to the bookstore, found the book, bought it, went home and read the thing that night. It's a short read. I mean, you can read it pretty quickly. And it was, I couldn't believe that I'd never heard of this author and how great it was. And so at that time, probably over the next year, so I read 30 of his books. He has like 60 books. And they're all pretty good. And all the Hatchet series, I know you've talked about that in the previous podcast, are all good. But he came about 5 or 6 years later, he came to a nearby school to give a talk. And our librarian found out about it. And we did that. We did Hatchet as a book in our book club. And we got like 35 kids to go to this thing. And he talked and he was just great, telling stories and stuff. And then afterwards, he did a book signing. He had a bunch of books there. And so I thought, well, I'll buy one I haven't read of his. And he had a book, I think it's called From Zero to 60, which is a little bit of a biography. And it's about him, I think, riding his motorcycle from New Mexico up to Alaska. And so I'm getting him to sign it. I should look for that copy. I don't know where it is right now. I got him to sign it. And he leans forward because it was all kids, middle schoolers and high schools, and then a few adults. He leans forward so the kids can't hear. He goes, don't pass this around to the kids. It's not really for kids, which is great. Yeah. And I didn't think it was anything really bad. There was a few swear words and that sort of thing in there, but he's just a fantastic writer. His style is so good and so easy to read. And just, Hatchet's a great book. If you haven't read it, you need to drop what you're doing and read it.
He also had some choice words for another outdoorsy type author as well.
Okay, I was going to avoid that, but I'll tell that story. So he comes on. He was literally in the first 30 seconds. He goes, don't read Jack London. The guy that wrote Call of the Wild and White Fang is, don't read Jack London. He's full of shit. He doesn't know what the hell he's talking about. and I actually I've read White Fang and I've read Call of the Wild and liked them both.
That
and then
rules.
I started to second guess my book choices after that because I was like, oh, maybe I don't know. So
was he more specific? Was he like, oh, they wouldn't have that many dogs, or what was it?
I want to say that he did because he also Gary's done the Iditarod a couple times, and the race up in Nome, Alaska. Where I forget how long it is, but it's like 10 days or something like that, and you have like a whole bunch of dogs racing this thing, and so he really knows his stuff about surviving in the wilderness and that sort of thing, as far as you can, I guess. And so he talked about the unreal, how the book wasn't realistic. That was his sort of take on it. So, and I haven't read it since. So.
I remember vividly reading both of those books in 5th grade and absolutely loving them. And then I remember too, we watched, it must have been a made for TV movie of Hatchet. And I just remember there's one scene that I remember specifically, which is he starts a fire. And then he realizes there are no more bugs because of the fire.
Yep.
And he starts jumping around and screaming, no more bugs, no more bugs. And that's always stuck with me for some reason. Yeah. That, and I think, doesn't he eat maggots at one point or bugs or something like that?
Like a grub worm. Yeah.
That's what it was. That's right. Okay. Yeah.
It's been a long time since I've read about it. JJ, is it in Brian's Winter, which is a sequel that he wrote as if he didn't leave? Doesn't he kill a moose and sleep in the pelt or the fur of the moose?
Yep. So in the first book, he's attacked by a moose.
Yes.
Which it sounds like it's just gut wrenching the way that the moose attacks him. And in Brian's so what's interesting is, so he wrote 2 direct sequels to Hatchet. One as if Brian was rescued and then asked to go back by NASA to teach survival skills, like, what do you have? How do you survive? And then another one that supposes Brian doesn't get rescued and what he does during the winter months because he was there in the summer and part of the fall. You would think like, oh, well, that's kind of copping out, but they are both so amazing and so engaging that you could literally put down one and pick up the other and just be engaged immediately.
It's also it's a good book to make you feel like how he has to rely on the land. I think the scene in Hatchet is where doesn't he see the bear eating the berries off the tree and he realizes, well, if he can survive on them, then I can. or maybe
Right.
it's another animal, but he sees an animal eating the berries off the tree because he doesn't know what to eat. He's a city kid. He has no idea what to do. And all he has is this hatchet. And he makes a lean-to for sleeping and all sorts of things. It's just a fantastic book.
I think it's in Brian's Winter, or is it Brian's Winter where he finds the turtle eggs, or maybe that's I think that's in Hatchet where he finds the turtle eggs and talks about eating them and how they're goopy, but you can tell he needs sustenance for it.
Yep. He gets protein.
I know that's a book that they recommend for young readers, and that's where you would find it in, a Barnes and Noble. But I think adults can get just as much out of that as a kid would.
I read it in my 30s. Couldn't believe how good it was. Can I recommend one more Gary Paulsen book?
Go for it.
He wrote a book. Like I said, I've read 30 of his books. He wrote a book called My Life in Dog Years. He loves dogs, and he talked about them a lot when we saw him. But he wrote a book called My Life in Dog Years, which is basically, I think it's 10 or 13, however many dogs it is. And he basically tells the time of owning this dog and how it sort of his life at that time, and how those dogs sort of befriended him and taught him lessons and stuff like that. But it's also a little bit of an autobiography. And that's my second favorite book of his. I think that book is just fantastic. So especially if you're a dog lover, get that book. That is a great Gary Paulsen book too.
There are so many amazing authors, and I know one of the things that Kevin and I share in common is I like to look through a person's library and just see what books they've chosen to own. Mm-hmm. Because every now and then you find something that's really unique and go like, oh, and in fact, Kevin mentioned, he goes, I noticed you've got a lot of memoirs and like autobiographies in your collection. Cause I finally got my brand new library up and I love it.
It looks fantastic, by the way.
Thank you so much. And that is something that, when I was piecing everything together, I noticed like I've got a lot of I love the memoir genre. It's a great genre.
Yeah. I find I tend to read in two areas when it goes to memoirs. I'll read, I actually like rock biographies. So Eric Clapton, Mick Fleetwood's book is really good. Trying to think of Eric Clapton. B.B. King's book is really good. Chuck Berry's book is really good. The famous one is Keith Richards' book. Pete Townsend. So I like rock biographies a lot. I also read a lot of just other. You, JJ, have a lot of improv books like I do, but I like a lot of comedians. I'll read a lot of books on comedians or that era. Which I find fascinating too.
That's a great segue into my first recommendation. So the last time I talked a lot about books that I had been reading because we were in the middle of the pandemic. Well, now that I have a commute again, I have been obsessed with audible.com. And I love listening to books, especially when they're read by either the author themselves or somebody who understands, theatricality behind it. And so it's almost like you're listening to like a radio play in a way. Yeah. And the first one I want to recommend is the head writer of SNL and the Weekend Update co-anchor, Colin Jost, his book, A Very Punchable Face, a memoir.
Yeah.
And I've been told that the book is great, but the audiobook is phenomenal. And they do the thing where it's not, they produce the audiobook and he acknowledges that he's reading the book to you in it. So there's other, you get you essentially get two different stories with slight differences between them. Colin Jost has got an interesting background in that he was a very smart kid and he went to Harvard. If you are interested in like the National Lampoon a movie, like series of movies and their publications, he was a member of the Lampoon and talks about the castle that they all would go to party in at Harvard. And he has all of these amazing showbiz kind of stories. And if you're obsessed with Saturday Night Live like I am, you will also get an amazing experience with that. Can you guys still hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, good. All of a sudden I was like, did this gray out? Anyway,
no, you're good.
So the most interesting part of the book that caught me completely off guard is he talked about 9/11, and his mother was the chief medical officer for the New York City Fire Department. And she was at ground zero on 9/11 and not only trying to help people right there, but he said for the next 6 months he didn't see his mother at all. She was constantly busy, whether it was talking to the spouse and children of a firefighter and she needed to explain in layman's terms that this person had inhaled so much smoke that their lungs are permanently damaged, or going with a chaplain to give the last rites to a firefighter who put everything on the line. But there's this poignant moment where he's going to school at Harvard at the time. So he's up in Boston, and his mom calls and says, I'm going to drive up there. And she drives up just to give him a hug, and then gets back in the car and goes back and has to continue her work again from there on out. And I thought to myself, there are so many stories from the tragedy of 9/11 that we haven't even begun to talk about. And this is a prime example of one, and how this guy can go and be such an amazing comedian when he's been that close to tragedy and had to process that in a way. And then on the flip side, he just got married to Scarlett Johansson, who he met while writing for this show. And he admits is like, yep, there's no reason why I should be married to who is considered one of the most beautiful people on the planet. Yeah. It is just a wonderful book, and he does such a good job reading it. And he talks about being like 13 years old and having to ride on the New York subway by himself to get to like this really high end fancy school. And, hearing him read that and do the impressions and the voices really sells this one. And so I highly recommend this. I remember telling it to your son, John, Kevin. I said,
he came right away and told me I had to get the book. So
right. Exactly. Yeah. And so it's a fantastic read. Again, previous guest Eric Hatch is actually the one who told me you need to pick up this book. It's so good. So that's my first recommendation of the episode is Man, Oh Man, A Very Punchable Face by Colin Jost. And if you see it in the cheap bin, or if you have a flight that you've got, or maybe you're driving to Wisconsin or something, this is a good audio book to pick up.
Can I just add one thing?
Yeah.
This is for all the listeners that are further afield, not from Fargo. JJ said that he is now that he's commuting again. You need to put this in perspective. His work is a mile from his house. It takes him probably 3 minutes to get there. So it's not like he's driving 40 miles a day or something like that.
And that's the beauty of it, right? Is the beauty of the fact that like I'm listening to these books in these short bursts.
And it'll take him 30 years to finish it because he'll get half a page done a day. But no,
yeah, and sometimes I just want to avoid my wife, so sometimes I just drive through the graveyard for 4 hours. So
there you go.
I
do it again.
My commute starts the moment I get out of bed, and then the 2 feet I walk to my computer desk, and then my commute is done.
And you turn on your Audible and listen for those 2 feet.
Yep.
Kevin, have you read anything recently that has really engaged you that you just, oh my gosh, this is the thing that I need to tell people about?
Yeah, I had a book on my shelf for 10 years at least, and it got me re-engaged with this author, and I've read a bunch of his books. Stephen Pressfield wrote, he's known from movies because he wrote The Legend of Bagger Vance, which I have not read. But probably his most famous book is called Gates of Fire, which is about the battle at Thermopylae, which if you've seen the movie 300, that's the story. It wasn't made from his book. And he has a great blog that comes out every Wednesdays about writing. And he has a book called The War of Art, which is about writing, but it's also about just being a creative person. So if you're creative in any fashion, a musician or an actor or an improv or whatever it is, this is a great book because it it deals with what he calls resistance. So, writer's block is what most people call it, but he says it is there for everything. And JJ and I were talking the other day, and one thing I always give JJ grief about is he has 7,000 ideas and projects, and it's problematic because most of them are pretty good, I'd have to say. And he talks about just sitting down and working. For me, it's writing. It's always just sitting down and writing and clearing the desk. And oftentimes it takes forever. And so he kind of goes through and he has a lot of videos, by the way, on YouTube, and I recommend them all. But that book about writing The War of Art, or about creativity, really stuck with me. And I reread it every year. And as a matter of fact, I pulled it off the shelf for this podcast, and I'm probably going to reread it again. It's really short. I have it right here. It's 162 pages, and they're all short chapters of 1 or 2 pages. And I read it probably in 1 or 2 settings, and I'll read it again, and I've marked it up, and I'm like, oh, wow, I forgot about this. Oh, yeah. This is what I'm going through right now. So that's a great book by him.
Do you find that it's a book that somebody, like, even if you're not necessarily in the world of art or creating, these things are applicable to everyday life? Like if you are an accountant.
Yeah, I would say that even an accountant, most people have a creative thing that they want to pursue, or for my son, it's stand up, and for you and I, for you, it's your podcast and writing and things like that. And we all have a sort of a creative thing, but I also think it's about doing the things that all of us have things we've wanted to try in our lives, and then we never get around. And it can be something as simple as playing on a summer softball team or something like that. His whole push is to like getting through that and realize it, and it's okay to not be good at these things. He's got like a couple books on this theme, and one of them is flat. The title says it all. It says, "Nobody wants to read your shit," is the title of the book. And that's pretty good too. And he said, you've got to get away from thinking that what you are doing is going to change the world, because you have no idea if it's going to change the world. It wasn't like the Beatles sat down and wrote, "I Want to Hold Your Hand," and said, "This is it. This is the song that's going to cause the breakthrough," because they don't know. And I think that's true of all artists.
That's interesting. And the first time that I ever experienced something like that in my life was with Tucker Lucas in Albuquerque, New Mexico.
Huh?
We had won a filmmaking competition in Fargo, and they had the international. So like each town, you made a movie in 48 hours, and each town had the winner from their town competing for the international awards. And so you go down there, and the first thing that you realize is these are all a bunch of other people who want to make movies, and they want you to listen to their pitch and figure out how you can help them.
Everyone's on the hustle. Everyone is following their own personal hero's quest, And
I remember Tucker at one point telling me, he's like, there's no point in like talking to any of these people about anything that has to do with movies, because all they want is to serve themselves. And so that was an amazing, astute observation by Tucker, because then it drastically changed our reason for being in Albuquerque, and we had one hell of a time in that town.
Once we kind of dropped the pretense of, let's go to Albuquerque for this, and let's change our futures, JJ, yeah, right. And then we got there, and we were like, let's just go like get some good food and watch a movie, and just enjoy ourselves and enjoy yourselves in the moment.
Yeah, it was pretty epic. But we did meet a guy who had just done the movie Beer Fest with Broken Lizard. And he plays a male prostitute in it. And I have a picture with him, and he has not done anything since. So I like to know, I knew him when, right? I knew him when. Okay. So the next book that I want to throw out there is another Hollywood story that is read, if you get the audiobook, by the person who wrote it, which is I Don't Know What You Know Me From, Confessions of a Co-Star, written by Judy Greer. Judy Greer, who is without a doubt, I think, one of the best, she's one of the best side actresses, like co-stars in Hollywood, but then the stuff that she's starred in is also really, really, really good too. I think of, she was in the movie Adaptation. She's in Jurassic World for all of 2 seconds. She's made her mark in 13 going on 30. She's made her mark all over the place. And here's what I like the most about listening to this book. So I listened to this book over the summer. She talks about how you can achieve a certain level of celebrity that allows you to remain fun and allows you to remain just slightly less noticeable so that you can do things like shop at Target. She talks about how her version of yoga is going to Target and drinking coffee and just walking around and then buying $20 worth of stuff. And while I'm listening to that, I was thinking, like, you are summing up probably 25 people on my Facebook friend list who that is their time where they can just walk and zone out and retail therapy, whatever you want to say. She also talks about what it was like to make it in the movies, and then she talks a lot about her childhood, which is really intriguing to me. And a friend of mine that I know from the radio world, his cousin is married to Judy Greer, and he was telling me about one night in Minneapolis, he met up with his cousin and Judy Greer was in town and they had like an amazing night. And he goes, you would not meet someone who's more down to earth, that when someone comes up and asks for an autograph, she'll kind of play dumb like it's not her. And then be like, no, that's me. And engages with them. And I think it's rare. It's becoming rarer and rarer to meet celebrities who you consider down to earth people. And this book is all about her and her philosophy of like, I don't, it'd be great if I made $100 million, but also I'm really happy where I am. And I've had a chance to work with some really great people. It's just, and she's funny. She is really, really funny in this book. So this is another one that I highly recommend if you're someone who likes Hollywood, if you've ever had the desire to quote unquote move to LA and try it out, see if it works. I like that one a lot.
I just FYI, I just went on Amazon while you're talking, looked at it and bought it. So there you go.
There you go. Now, if we had like an Amazon Smile page where we got a kickback from it, that would be great. But we're not a nonprofit, so we don't have that.
We would be making tens of cents. That'd be awesome.
Oh God, think of what we could do with that money.
Yeah. I'll give you. I wrote down books, all sorts of books, and I have them kind of in categories like the authors that I read, and I liked them so much. I read a bunch of their books. And so I'm going to do the next one. I'm going to do a classic that most people have read at least one of his books. John Steinbeck was my first author that I fell in love with in college. And most people read of Mice and Men. By the way, as a teacher who's taught of Mice and Men 20 times, I will say this. That is one of the most perfectly constructed books ever written. It's 109 pages. You can read it in 1 or 2 sittings. And the ending is so shocking. I'm not going to give anything away. It's so shocking and so unexpected. But when you think about it, there is no other possible ending to the book. Have you guys both read that? Did you read it in school or anything?
Oh yeah.
Yep. That's part of the curriculum. And I love Steinbeck, and I worship at the altar of Mice and Men.
Yeah, I'm a huge, and the great thing about that book is it was made into a great play. So it's a 10 out of 10 book. It's a 10 out of 10 play. It was also cut down to a 1 act that I've seen, and that's a 10 out of 10. And the movie with John Malkovich and Gary Sinise is a 10 out of 10. You never see that. Usually the movie is terrible, or if it's made into a play, it's really clunky or something like that. That book is just, I love teaching that book.
Before you go on, I got to tell you, I think of Mice and Men, and two things come to mind. Number one, after I read that book, I seriously considered wearing a glove on one of my hands, just like Curly did, to keep it soft for a girlfriend or possible wife in the future. And that had stuck with me. Even when I was doing manual labor, I thought about that when I'd put my work gloves on. I was like, I got to keep my hands soft. Number 2, when John Malkovich hosted SNL after this movie had come out, one of the greatest sketches in SNL history accompanied it, which was Paramount Pictures, after testing with audiences, realizes that the ending of Mice and Men is too sad and depressing. Here are some alternate endings. And it is amazing what they do with it. And Chris Farley's in the sketch. And if you have not seen it, I highly, highly recommend you seek the SNL of Mice and Men out, because it is wonderful. But you do need to have had to watch or read the book or watch the movie before you go see it, because you don't want to spoil the ending.
The movie.
Go ahead.
The movie is something that has deeply resonated with me ever since I saw it in school. We watched it in school, and after reading the book, because that very last shot, it's not in the book. It's just this way they chose to end the movie, which is this beautiful shot that just perfectly describes the relationship between these two brothers.
Yep.
And that moment is so unbelievably heartbreaking. It shattered me when I saw it, and even thinking about it now, it makes me choke up. Like it's a unbelievably beautiful piece of art, and yep. I only wish all film adaptations of books could have that kind of impact.
Yeah,
that one did.
He's right. The ending. This doesn't give anything away, but Gary Sinise is sitting on a train in a boxcar, and these reflections the lights are coming off his face because they're driving at night, but it's like the moon or something like that. And you just see him sitting there and thinking, and it's amazing. It's getting me choked up too. It's a great, great ending to that movie.
Because if I remember, the memory he has is you're seeing the two of them walking, and then John Malkovich puts his hand or his finger in his brother's pocket.
Yep.
As they're going. Yep. And I can't. Yeah. I'm going to start crying. We got to talk about something else. That is such a beautiful book, play, movie combo.
Yeah. In the John Steinbeck vein, he's written quite a few books that I've read almost all of his books. A lot of people have read The Red Pony or The Pearl in grade school or middle school. That's a popular one. He's most famous for The Grapes of Wrath, which is very good, which I read in college. But my favorite book of his actually is probably East of Eden. He sat down to write a book about his family, and he got about 80 pages in and realized he didn't have enough for a book. And so then he started writing a book about the Cain and Abel story. That he used that as a background. He didn't write the Cain and Abel story, but about two brothers and stuff like that. And that he started to weave this fictional story in with his family story. And East of Eden's like 500 pages, and I couldn't put it down. I thought that was great. He also wrote a book called Travels with Charlie.
That's my favorite.
Oh God, what a great book! Which is his name of his dog, and he gets in a camper van. Well, it's a truck, pickup truck with one of those campers on the back of it, and he travels around the country with his dog. And it was late in life. I think he wrote in 62 maybe, and maybe he died in 67. I don't remember exactly when it was, but that book is a great sort of on the road tale, which I really enjoyed his too.
I'm sensing a theme that Kevin Kennedy likes dog books,
which is funny because I'm not a dog person. There you go. I just admitted that.
Are you really big into Clifford?
No, I hate Clifford. No, you'll probably get hate mail because I'm just not a dog person because I didn't grow up with dogs. We have a dog. I like cats way better. But we can't have a cat because my daughter is allergic, so I'll never get a cat again. And I like cats, but there you go. So yeah,
I have a very embarrassing childhood memory that centers around Clifford, the big red dog.
Oh, do tell.
And I was first grade, Mrs. Honnell's class at Horseman Elementary. Yes. And I was a really anxious kid and I was really shy. And I was always nervous at school because I wasn't at home in my, comforting space and stuff. And didn't have really many friends. And school was tough. And then one day, Mrs. Honnell said, we're going to have a special guest today who's going to read us a book. And it was one of the librarians at the school who was dressed up in a Clifford the Big Red Dog costume. And when she walked in the room, I was so overcome with joy at seeing Clifford the big red dog come running in the room that I jumped out of my desk and ran straight to Clifford and gave Clifford a huge hug because I was like, oh my God, thank God, right? Someone I know, because I had Clifford books at home. And then I realized that I'm the only kid who has done this, and all the other kids are still sitting in their desks. And so I was mortified, and I had to walk back to my desk. And then they said, "All right, everyone, now get out of your desks." And we all sat on the ground, crisscross applesauce style, while Clifford read to us. And I sat at the back of the group because I was so mortified that I had just done that. I have never told that story before until right now.
JJ's going to dress up in a Clifford the Big Red Dog suit. Give you a hug.
Yeah. I felt the same way. Related. I went to a Meet John Ritter event who voiced Clifford the Big Red Dog in the PBS series. And when I tried to hug Mr. Ritter, they told me, "Hey man, Three's company." Because there were two security guards already there.
They were like, "Hey man, don't be a problem child."
Oh, damn it. Why did you nail that joke and I only half-assed it? Well done. Good work. Good work.
I think it's because I just became vulnerable there for a bit, so I needed to rebound back from it.
Your defense mechanism was up.
Yeah.
Kevin, before we leave John Steinbeck, I'll say I think that people don't give enough credit to tortilla flats. Yeah, because that's another one I really love.
Yep. Yeah. And Cannery Row's another big one. That's really good. But Tortilla Flat's great. Yeah. Yeah. His whole stories they almost all take place in California and sort of the immigrant lifestyle or the migrant farmer work lifestyle. They're very good books. Yeah.
He does a great job just getting you into like another time.
Yeah.
That seems like really accessible, but he's an excellent writer. Do you remember a time when there was a push for more like American lit to be taught? Because I think for a long time, a lot of syllabuses used like European writers. And I think John Steinbeck is an example of like an easy way that they can get in with like pushing U.S. literature.
Yeah, I think when I was in high school, and it's kind of this way today that you have 2 years of lit. Actually, it's changing now because they're trying to get more diverse and more world lit. But when I was started teaching, but also when I was in school, it was junior year was usually American lit, and senior year was Brit lit. Now they've changed that a little bit to world lit. Sometimes sophomore year will be world lit. It's one of those things, you find an author and it gets in the, think about this. To Kill a Mockingbird was written, I think in 1960, and in 1961, the movie came out and it was in the curriculum by 1962 everywhere. And it's still in the curriculum in 2021. And it's a great book.
So let me ask you this. One of the most engaging book series that has come out in the last 50 years has got to be the Harry Potter series. And yet there is an uphill battle to get that involved in curriculum in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah.
Do you think that's fair?
Okay. Full disclosure. You guys were little or younger, I should say, when those books came out, right? What grade were you guys in? 7th, 8th grade when those came out? When the first one came out?
What year was that?
Probably 97, 98, somewhere in there, wasn't it?
So I was, I would have been in 7th grade. JJ probably would have been in 8th grade.
Okay. Then. Those books came out, the movies came out, and I was it was, the series, probably the third book came out when I started teaching, or second, whatever it was. And kids were just reading them left and right. And finally I waited until all my kids were a little bit older. So maybe 5, 6, and 7, somewhere in that range. And I read the first one, and I was an adult and the book just didn't hit me the right way. Now I know of adults that have read them and loved them. And I read the first 2 and I started the third, and I was so exhausted that I just couldn't do it anymore because I read them out loud to my kids and they loved them. So it hasn't resonated with me. as a, and the big thing, one of the reasons that book gets banned sometimes is because the whole, it's witchcraft and all this sort of thing. So you get the people that think you're, going to turn all the kids into witches and warlocks or something like that want to ban those books. So sometimes they get taken out of libraries. I'm all for any book that gets a kid to read. The big thing now is we have kids that are really into manga books, the Japanese, I don't want to call them cartoon books.
And, no, you're right. I mean, it's a comic style. It's basically the art style that's really influenced, comes out of Japan.
And if we have at my school, the librarian is very open to, kids can come up and say, hey, can you get this book or that book? And she'll just get it. And there's a core of kids that are really into those. And you can read one in a day. And you'll see kids walking around with a stack of those books. Now, they're not mine. They're not for me. My daughter was really into them and she loved them and stuff like that. She started them in 5th grade. It's not my thing. But if it gets a kid reading, I'm all for it, So it's one of those things you have to make a judgment call. I don't know. Will it be in the curriculum in 50 years? Hard to say. I don't know.
What's really, when you were talking about the banning of them, I think that's, banning a book is one of the silliest self-owns anyone can try to do, because the moment you ban a book, you are amplifying that book tenfold. Once people know that someone in authority is saying you are not allowed to read this, that is the only thing they want to read. Like I don't understand that impulse when it comes to books, at least, in that area, or even when, Mark Twain's books have gone through the same treatment. And still do because of the language that's in them. But if you're trying to suppress it, if you want to guarantee it becomes popular, ban it.
So here's a great John Steinbeck story, and I tell this in my class all the time. John Steinbeck was 9, 10, I think, and his dad called him into his study. He had a study in his house. His family was fairly wealthy. They owned land and things like that. His dad calls him into his study, and it was basically a library. He had floor-to-ceiling books, stuff like that. And he looks around the room, and he says to his son, he says, okay, here's the deal. You can read any book in this library at any time you want, except those books on that top shelf over there. You are not under any circumstances to read those books up on that shelf. And he points to a shelf at the top. And then that's it, and lets the kid leave. Now, of course, when you're thinking about it, what books did he read? He read the books on that shelf.
Mm-hmm.
But the genius thing about it was those are exactly the books his dad wanted him to read.
Right.
So he told him he couldn't read them. So John says, he didn't figure that out till later because he said I would sneak the book off. I'd hide in my room and read it and hide the book under my mattress and go through it as fast as I can to make sure I could get it back to the shelf so he wouldn't miss it. But he says, I'm reading it going, okay, what is it he didn't want me to see in here? I've got to find it. He said, I read 25 books in 25 weeks or whatever because I wanted to find out what it was. And he said, I got such an education out of that. Yeah, I agree. It is a cell phone. That's a perfect way of putting it.
That is absolutely brilliant. I also like to comment too, and you were saying earlier about, the Harry Potter books and what gets kids into reading. I took to reading really early on because my dad, when I was probably 5 years old, gave me all of his old comic books. And so obviously as a little kid who can't read, the first thing I'm drawn to are the pictures, but I can tell that there are ciphers here. There are the things here that I can't understand that will unlock this story for me. And so I would study these words and focus on these words, and it helped me get into reading. And that was my springboard into just books, was comic books. When it comes to manga and stuff, anything like that's sequential art is a really, really awesome way to get into literature if you're not into it already and you're a little maybe anxious about it, or you think it's going to be too boring because it's kind of the right speed for some people. But I love that stuff.
Whenever I talk to somebody that's a big reader like I am, we often talk about what do people do that don't read? How do they spend, and I'm as guilty as anybody is scrolling through my phone and looking at garbage on the internet and stuff like that. But I can't fathom a life without books. I just can't. I don't know what people do that don't read. And kids proudly tell me all the time. Famously, my first year teaching, excuse me, a girl. I'm handing out the book 1984. It's my first year teaching. I'm a new, excited teacher. And I hand out the book 1984 to this girl, Amy. And she looks up at me as I'm handing her the book and she goes, I ain't read a book in 4 years and I ain't starting now. And I was so stunned by that and kind of bummed by that because she probably was wearing her lack of reading on her sleeve. And I don't get that. So I'm really appreciative of librarians, especially they're like, well, you just haven't found the right book. And unfortunately in school, we have to assign books so we can have discussions and papers and stuff like that. I get that. But sometimes books don't speak to a person. So we just got to find the right book to get in the kids' hands.
I think more often than not, a teacher who just kind of settles and gets not lazy. That's not the word I'm looking for, but who has a method that works.
Yeah.
Is the one who all of a sudden they're 30 years into their teaching career and they haven't updated their syllabus.
Yeah.
And that's unfortunate. One of the books I was talking about with Kevin the other day that was one of the things that got me really engaged with reading was Until They Bring the Streetcars Back by Stanley Gordon West.
Yep.
And not only did I just love the book because it was about a place I've been to, it was about St. Paul, Minnesota, and a history that I knew nothing of. So it was able to educate me in that way. But also the English department at Fargo South High reached out to Stanley Gordon West, who at that time still lived in St. Paul, and got some money together for him to be driven to Fargo, or he flew or something like that. But then they'd take him out to lunch and then he would talk to all the English classes the next day. And if you wanted to get a book and you could get it signed, and I've got a full collection of Stanley Gordon West books that are amazing. And if you bring them up to kids today, like that I went to high school with, they'll be like, oh yeah, like Finding Laura Bugs. And I'm like, yep, exactly. So to me, it's great.
We had him come to our school too when I first started teaching, and I read the book just before he came, and I was like, that's such a good book, Until They Bring the Streetcars Back, because it brings you back to a time that you've heard about, but you don't really know that much about. Because even for me, it was 10 years before I was born, and it's in the 50s in St. Paul, and and then meeting him and him talking about it, and I did the same thing, ran up to him, got his autograph, and had him sign the books and the whole deal. It was great.
Well, and for me, it was perfect because I could talk to my parents, and like my dad was born in 1951. So he remembered that era. And so now all of a sudden I'm reading a book where I can engage with my parents about it. Like, come on, man, it is perfect. But there's nothing in the curriculum that said that they had to read that book. It was just something that the English department decided, you know what, we're going to make a point of this because we can give a 360-degree view of how this book came to be. It's engaging, and I think these kids will love it. Plus, I remember my English teacher, I had the same English teacher for 3 years, and she was amazing, and she was the principal's wife, so I think she got away with stuff, but she was just one of those educators who made everything so much fun. But like the last day, the day we finished the book, she gave everybody a salted nut roll, which plays into the plot of the book, and I just thought that was so cool. God, yeah. I love that.
Yeah, the salted nut rolls are made down in St. Paul. That's why they ate them. They still make them down there. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. In fact, I've got a friend in Hawaii, and I send her a salted nut roll. In fact, Jill had me pick up this one that turns out like it was from the salted nut roll company, but it was a giant log. It weighed like 3 pounds. And so she told me that she had to cut little chunks off.
Yeah. I'll give you another author that I fell in love with, and I read a whole bunch of his books. And this is a British author. It's his full name is W. Somerset Maugham, and his biggest book is called Of Human Bondage, which is great. But the book that he's semi-famous for is The Razor's Edge, and which tells a story of a guy that it takes place. He goes to World War I as an ambulance driver. He's an American that goes to World War I as an ambulance driver, and he comes back, and we didn't know about this, but he comes back. He has PTSD, and he starts drinking and stuff like that. And he was supposed to get married, and then he needs to find himself, so he goes to Europe and sort of lives a vagabond lifestyle going from place to place. And the woman that he was supposed to marry, she has family over in Europe, so she goes over to find him in London, I believe, or maybe it's Paris. Finds him in Paris and is like, "What's the deal? We're getting married." And he's like, "I'll marry you, but we're gonna live this kind of lifestyle." And she's wealthy. He was wealthy growing up and all this stuff. And she says no. And he goes to the Far East to find himself with the Tibetan monks and goes up. And he comes back later after the crash in 29, and the whole world has changed, but he has been changed by this experience. And he bumps into the woman that he was supposed to marry. She's married somebody else, and now they've lost all their money because of the crash and all stuff. The reason I bring that book up is that was made into a movie with Bill Murray in it. And have you ever seen that, JJ? Razor's Edge?
I don't think I have.
Okay, so I need to brace your audience for this then. So Bill Murray was coming off of Ghostbusters, and he said, I don't know if it's Paramount Pictures, but whoever the studio was, he went to him, he says, "Here's the deal. I'll sign on for your next comedy, whatever it was at the time, but I really want to make this movie. And I'm telling you up front, the movie's going to lose money, but this book means a lot to me. It's changed my life, and I really want to make this movie." And so he makes the movie, and it did lose money. And I would tell people that it's a fantastic movie. The problem with it is you're expecting at any moment for Bill Murray to make you start laughing, and he doesn't. But when you get past that it's not a comedy and he isn't meant to be funny, it really opens up the movie for you. And you just see that it's a really kind of a meaning of life. What are we doing? Why are we doing what we are doing kind of thing? And it completely changes this guy's trajectory in the book and in the movie. So it's a really great movie. It's a really great book. That's another short one, maybe 180 pages or 200 pages. But Somerset Maugham is his name. And any book by him I would recommend. He's written a lot of plays too, which are also very good. British writer, those sorts of things. So.
Oh, I'm going to seek this out immediately.
Good.
Now, 1984, Razor's Edge.
Yep. Oh. Yep. And isn't that the year Ghostbusters came out? It was right around that time.
No,
I think so.
Was it 84 or 83? 84.
84, yeah. So I think the deal was he'd make that movie, and if they let him make, and he was such a big star at that time, they kind of let him do whatever he wanted because he'd done Stripes and Caddyshack and all that by then. So yeah. Yeah. Watch the movie. It'll throw you off, JJ, as a Bill Murray fan. You'll watch and you're like, oh, this is not what I was expecting. And when you can get past that, you'll love it. You'll love it.
And I mean, there are plenty of great Bill Murray, more dramatic roles that he's done over the years too. Everything from Broken Flowers to Lost in Translation. And so clearly this is something that had been in him for a long time, and he didn't just want to make the same stuff. I just read an interesting piece about how like Bill Murray took a break from Hollywood, and his first movie back from that break was Scrooged. And it took a lot for everyone to get on the same page for him to come back and do this. And he's like, I just don't want to do these, he doesn't want to do Caddyshack and do the voice and stuff like that anymore. And he's an interesting cat. I wonder, does he have a memoir out yet? I don't think he does.
There's books on him that are pretty great, and I'm trying to think of one off the top of my head. It's like the Secret Life of Bill Murray or something like that, or Being Bill Murray, or I have to look it up on Amazon. But I've got a couple. I
think one of my favorite Bill Murray moments of all time was at the Academy Awards when he added in Harold Ramis after the Best Directors nominations. I just thought that was a really sweet moment where Murray's true heart was on display, and he's got a very big heart.
Yeah. And when you hear about, like in one of my favorite books of all time, Guru, My Days with Del Close, he talks about Bill Murray showing up to Del's hospital when Del was dying. And, he was a huge star at that time, and how he didn't want any pomp and circumstance. And then he paid for this party that they threw at Del, like with, food and drinks and everything
in the hospital.
In the hospital. Yeah. So that everyone could come and like have this living wake for Dell. And Jeff Griggs goes, and Bill Murray paid for it, but he didn't say, I'll get this, you guys. He just quietly paid the bill when no one was looking. And you just think of like, what a class act that Bill Murray is.
Yeah. And
hey, speaking of writers, Kevin, have you seen Where the Buffalo Roam, his Hunter S. Thompson role?
No.
So, yeah. So, when people think of Hunter S. Thompson on the big screen, a lot of people think of course, Johnny Depp playing him, right?
Yeah.
But Where the Buffalo Roam is actually my preferred Hunter S. Thompson pseudo biopic, and it's just wonderful. And it's from the 80s, and it's a great movie that shows a different side of Bill Murray than you've seen before, and he does just a wonderful job with it. But
I just wrote that down too. I'm gonna watch that then too.
Yeah, there you go. So it's not just books; it's also movies. Bill Murray movies. We can only suggest Bill Murray movies, though. That's the rule.
Yeah.
As we're winding this second edition of the JJ Meets World Book Club down, anything else off the top of your head, Kevin, that you want to make sure that the listeners hear about?
Yeah, I tend to go also in subject areas. So I got real interested in the Holocaust. So I read a bunch of books on the Holocaust. At one point, I got really fascinated by Vietnam, and I've read a lot of books on Vietnam. And the book that was the window into that genre or that type of book was a book called Nam, N-A-M. And it was by Mark Baker, and it's out of print. But I found a copy on Amazon and got it 4 months ago and gave it to a friend to read. And Mark Baker went around and just interviewed a whole slew of veterans, and they tell snippets about what it's like when you first get to the country and when a buddy gets killed and things like that. It was just, it was so moving to me when I read that book first that I went out and I've probably read 150 books on Vietnam, mostly first person soldier point of view. But that book is still stuck with me. There's another one called Blood Brothers. I don't remember who wrote it, which is the Black Soldier's Experience, which is really good. Sort of one of the famous ones that came out of that. And the reason I mention this is because another one of my favorite writers, also a Minnesota writer, is Tim O'Brien, who wrote The Things They Carried. Tim O'Brien is a vet that came back just like the Bill Murray Razor's Edge, completely changed by the war, and most of his books have a Vietnam element to them. And The Things They Carried is a fictionalized thing. He also wrote, Going After Casciato, which he won the book award for. I've read every book by him. I went and saw him do a book signing and talked to him for a long time. It turned out my buddy went with me, and he's from Worthington, Minnesota. My buddy's dad was from Worthington, Minnesota, and I started mentioning family names, and he knew all of them. It was really interesting. But the book is often excerpted because it's almost like short stories. So, and they all have titles. So it's like On the Rainy River. He was very close to running into Canada and couldn't bring himself to do it. He told that story when I saw him read, and it was just fascinating. So he's another writer that you can just eat up all his books and not be disappointed. You mentioned JJ before, Chuck Klosterman in your last one.
Yeah.
And you mentioned Downtown. A friend gave me a copy of Sex, Drugs, and Cocoa Puffs. Now, most of your readers here or listeners here in Fargo know of him, but a lot of people far afield don't. Oh my gosh, he is one of the funniest writers I've ever read, and he's another one where I haven't read Downtown Owl. I went through all of his books like really quickly because I couldn't put him down. And one that's dear to your heart, JJ, because I know you've read a lot of his books, is David Sedaris.
Yes.
If you read nothing else, please read Me Talk Pretty one day. Oh my God. My first year teaching, a teacher was reading this and she goes, "Have you read this?" And I go, "I don't even know who it is." And she goes, "You got to read it." And I read it, and it's just stories of his life. And the story about his brother Rooster was one. I mean, I was reading it in school during reading time, and I would start laughing, and the kids would stop reading and look at me and go, "What are you reading?" And I couldn't read it out loud because it was inappropriate, but hysterically funny. So anything by David Sedaris, Barrel Fever, Naked, is it
Dressing Family in Denim is a great one.
What's the one about owls? Oh gosh, I can't remember the title of the book about owls, but he is just funny. And you got to meet him because you did, you also did Santaland Diaries. And you got to meet him. I got to do improv with his sister at one point.
Ooh, I'm jealous of that.
Yeah, she's weird, and you can see where that family gets it all from. But yeah, she was in Chicago and I was in Chicago. She was a nobody, and I remember thinking, man, she is funny. So yeah, there's some writers that you can pick up, and some are funny, some are serious. So yeah, and don't forget the classics. The classics are always great too. So,
hey, Kevin, yeah. I'm really interested in how you approach your book organization and how you shelve your books. Because obviously JJ has gorgeous bookshelves. I've been working on a bookshelf project at home here too. As a voracious reader, there's just something that's so attractive about bookshelves in general. But the thing that really gets me is that when I look at books and I'm trying to organize them, I get a little OCD, and it's complicated because there's no standard size for a book. Yep. There's no standard, color palette or anything like that. So what do you do to organize your books and keep them cohesive?
This is a complicated answer or subject for me. But so I buy, for every book I read, I probably buy 5. And just like JJ mentioned that book earlier, I was like, oh, that sounds interesting. I looked at it on Amazon and I go, oh, I want this. And so I buy books all the time. The problem is I don't get through them fast enough. My goal is always 2 books a week. I don't usually make that, but I usually get at least a book a week read. So
that's a really good pace, though. That's a very good pace.
Yeah, I know. And there's a lot of people that are like, if they read 1 book a year, it's a big deal. I probably read, I write them down. So I read 50 some last year, and usually I'm in the 70 range. I'll read 70 books. Sometimes I get over 100, but that's maybe twice in the last 20 years. Okay, so the goal is to do them by subject. So if I have books on writing, they'll be together. If I have books on another area, which we didn't even get into, was I read a lot of what we'd call popular mathematics books. And they're not like math textbooks, but Paul Erdős, who's a famous mathematician who no one's ever heard of that on your podcast. There's books about him that I found really fascinating. Surely You Must Be Joking, Mr. Feynman by Richard Feynman is one of the best books about a physicist that really kind of became popular. But anyway, I digress. So I put them by subjects. The problem is I have probably 4,000 books in my house, and I have shelf space for probably 3,000 books. So I've got in front of my shelf in my bedroom where the clock is, it gets me up in the morning, there's stacks of probably 25 books there. In my office, I've taken over my daughter's room, and there's about 15 books stacked behind me. And then in my room, there's so many books stacked up that I've literally had to step over the stacks of books because I don't have a shelf space for them. And every once in a while, I'll go through and sort of organize them, or I'll buy another shelf. What I need is some of my kids to move out of the house so I can get more shelving.
Just some of them, right? Just some of them.
Yeah, they don't all need to go. I just need to take over their rooms and put up shelving. That's kind of how I do it. I'll do it by subject. So I have a whole section of Holocaust books and a whole section of Vietnam books, and I have my novels as a rule mostly together. I bought a lot of sports books. Those are usually together. My comedy, JJ and I really share a love of comedy, and I probably have 40 or 50 improv books or books on acting or theater and stuff like that because I'm a drama teacher. So those are all together. But it's tough sometimes because sometimes somebody will ask for a book and I have to really go search for it. I kind of know where it is, but yeah, it can be a bit of a problem. That's the other thing. Like you said, the books are all different size, which is really annoying.
Right.
And a shelf will get full, and then sometimes I'll like, oh, this should go with those books, and then I'll do the sideways thing, This friend of mine I mentioned before, Dennis Wadley, told me I know when the books become sideways on top of the other books that it's time to purge. But I will tell you the little anecdote. I went down to Mississippi, Oxford, Mississippi, and I forget what the name of his house was, but it was Faulkner's house. This was 25 years ago. We were just driving around the country, my wife and I, and we stopped at his house, and you can tour the house. And we went in the house, and there was no books in the house. And they'd kind of preserved it as a museum type thing. And I was talking to the graduate student that was a graduate student in William Faulkner Studies, which I didn't know was a thing at the University of Mississippi. And she got so excited telling the story of him. And apparently when he died and they went in this house, they said there was not a flat surface in the house that didn't have books stacked on it, including the stove. So this guy had books everywhere. They said there was over 10,000 books in the house, and everything that had a surface had books stacked, not one, but stacks of books. And I remember saying to my wife says, sounds like you. I find the only way I can purge books is when I move. So when I moved up here, this will tell you something. When I moved up here, I purged books. I took 72 boxes of books to a used bookstore and sold them. 72 boxes. Yeah.
Wow.
That's true. And it was, yeah. And when my dad died, my dad had a lot of books, and I inherited probably 1,000 books from him. And so I got rid of some of those. But yeah, I've got a lot of books, probably more than I'll ever read in my life, which some people think is ridiculous, but I don't know. Maybe it is.
I'm going to express a little bit of shock here, because I thought one of the first things that we would talk about when we were talking about books today is Kevin and I both have a very deep love for Louis L'Amour books.
Yes.
And I inherited from my grandfather a beautiful leather-bound complete set of Louis L'Amour that I've been working my way through. And it is it's one of the things I'm probably the most proud of in my house, is like when people come in and they look, and what's nice about them, they are all the same size. They are all the same color. And on the spine is in gold leaf, the name Louis L'Amour, and then the title of the book. So putting them together, I just did chronological order, which I thought worked out the best.
Sure.
Brown leather, right? Brown leather?
Brown leather. Yep.
So do you guys know who's a massive Louis L'Amour fan?
Who?
Your dad.
Previous podcast guest, Bill Lucas.
Really?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, one of the my dad, I don't think he has them anymore, but I just always remember growing up, my father has owned and read every single Louis L'Amour book ever written.
He has over 200, by the way.
Yeah. Yep. And I just always have remembered this. My dad used to have this bookshelf that was just Louis L'Amour, period. And it was so many books, and I never read any of them, but I always immediately think of my dad whenever I think of Louis L'Amour. And I remember JJ, those brown leather books, because he had those.
Oh yeah.
Gorgeous.
Okay. Quick Louis L'Amour story. And so when I was a kid, there's a guy across the street from me named Walter Neubauer. He was, I was, early teens. I was 12, 13, 14, and he was in his 70s and stuff. And we used to talk. I'm a huge Twins fan, and he'd come out and he used to grouse about the Twins and he called them the Sandlot Boys, and that was his term for them because they were never winning enough and all that. And one day he comes out, and I must have been 12, so probably sixth grade. He walks out and he goes, "Kennedy, come here." He had a gruff voice, and I said, "Yeah." I think I was throwing the ball against the stairs, and he goes, "I got something for you." And he walked, and he had 6 Louis L'Amour books with a rubber band around them. And Louis L'Amour books, if you haven't read them, are Westerns, and there's always the good guy, bad guy thing. They're very well researched in that the places are very accurate. And they're all around 200 pages. Isn't that about right, JJ?
Yeah. I mean, he's got a couple that are thicker than that, but for the most part, they're easy. They're weekend reads. Yeah.
So he hands me this stack of books, and he goes, "Read these and let me know what you think. And when you get done with that, I got more." And I wasn't a Western reader. I hadn't, so I was like, okay. And I felt like it was, required reading or something. So I go up in my room, and I can remember the title. The top book was called Passin' Through, with no G, Passin' Through. And there's a picture of a guy like climbing up the side of a dirt trail, like about to go over this hill, where some bad stuff was happening. He's got a rifle in his hand. And I read that book, and I'd read it in one sitting. I was like, this is so good. So I went through all 6 of the books. Next time I saw him, I went out there and I gave him those back. I goes, oh, stay right there. I got more. And he went in and he got me another 6 with a rubber band around them. And I probably did that and read, I don't know, probably 20 of the books over probably a year or something of those books. And it caused me to read a book that has affected me, a Louis L'Amour book that has affected me to this day. And I told JJ this. He wrote a biography called Education of a Wandering Man, which is very good. And I recommend, I don't know if that's in the collection, JJ, but if it's not, I would add it to it. And it's his biography. And it's another one. It's probably $250. And it tells how his life started and all that stuff. But one of the things he does is at the back of the book, he listed, and this was in the 30s, he listed all the books he read for a given year. So 1931, he read these books, and it was 50, 60 books, whatever it is. 1932, and it went on for pages and pages. And I thought, that is a great idea. So I went in my house, and I found this old journal. It says record on the front of it. It's an old sort of, it's an account book. I'm looking at the inside of it right now. And it says 1946 on it. And whatever it was, it starts on page 5 because the first few pages, my sisters had got it when my grandma died. It was my grandpa's book, and they had written, journaled in it or something like that. Just stupid stuff when they were probably 10, 11, 12. I tore those pages out, and I started in the 15th, 10/15, so October 15th of 1990. I wrote down the name of the book that I read. And then I've been doing that faithfully now for 30 years. And so I've got 30 years in here of books. And every year I write down all the books. I write down how many I read, how many pages I read, whether they're fiction or nonfiction, and how much I averaged reading per day. That's just my little math brain working there. And I've been doing that faithfully for 30 years. And what's cool about that is I can look back over the years and see, like the Gary Paulsen thing. One day I was paging through it, and I came across it, and I was like, oh my gosh, I read 30 Gary Paulsen books over the course of 2 months. It was crazy. His are really easy to read. And I see themes in my life which were really interesting when I had a big Vietnam kick, all these books that I read. So that's my Louis L'Amour story. I'm a big fan of Louis L'Amour. Some people aren't into Westerns. That's fine, but he's a very good plot-driven writer. And you'll be very
entertained. How thick is this notebook?
It's let me see how many pages it goes.
Been writing in it for 30 years?
30 years. So every page has 37 lines. I know that. And sometimes I'll get onto the third page, which means I've got over 74 books. This notebook looks like it's close. It's 246 pages. It's a ledger-sized book. So it's a little oversized. It's probably 14, 15, 18 inches tall and probably 8.5 wide.
So like how far through it have you filled?
Look at that. I'm on page 84. So I started on page 5. Yeah.
So you've got a lot of pages to go still. Like
Yeah. So like I said, every year takes about 2 pages. Like I said, that's 74 entries. It's cool. It means a lot to me. And also it's a good way to look back and go, sometimes there's been times I got a book out recently that I was like, God, did I read this? And I had to scan back 15 years through the book. And I'm like, oh yeah, I read that back in 2005. Okay. Because I read it, I start reading and you're like, wow, here's a little side note that I think you'll find interesting. The listeners will find interesting. One of the rock biographies, I read this 25 years ago, was a book on Jim Morrison. And Jim Morrison, a lot of people don't know, was a prolific I And he had a game. He had like 1,000 books in his bedroom when he was a kid, when he was a teenager. And I always get to ask this, and I asked JJ this the other day. People always ask me, have you read all these books? And I always just tell them, oh yeah, of course. No, I haven't. But that's people always are like, why do you have this? You've read all these? But Jim Morrison had read all the books, and he would play a game with his friends. His friends would come over and he'd say, okay, I'm going to close my eyes. You pick any book off the shelf. and turn to the beginning of any chapter of any book. And the goal is me to tell you what the book is and who the author is before you get through with that first page of that chapter. It can be chapter 26 of whatever it is. And he said he never lost. This is written by somebody else. And they said he never lost because that's how much he read, but he can tell. And I found that too, that I can read a book and I go, okay, I know. I remember that book. Okay, that's by, it's called da-da-da. And so I don't have memory for anything else, but I have memory for most of my books. So
I've always really wondered too, what the long-term positive effects are of, routine, regular reading. I mean, obviously things like where you have mental decline or, diseases that might affect that. I believe there's some anecdotal or there's some evidence that it definitely helps keeping your brain elastic and keeps it moving. If you're a Game of Thrones fan, at least of the TV show, and you think of Tyrion Lannister talking about sharpening his brain with a book the way you'd sharpen a sword with a whetstone. I would be really, really interested to see what other things could be sort of verified in a lab almost about the positive effects of reading.
Well, there's been research on the reading thing, and that absolutely does keep your brain elastic and stuff like that. I think the mistake most people make, and I gave up trying, people think, I don't have time to read because, I don't have an hour to put aside or half an hour or whatever it is, which is garbage. And I was that way for a while because you're like, I don't have time to read this whole chapter or whatever. And for me, once I realized that I could put reading in the nooks and crannies of my life, as I've heard it described, a little bit here, a little bit there, you'd be surprised how many books you read. As a matter of fact, I rarely sit down and read for a solid hour. I ride a stationary bike in my house, and I'll read every morning on that. That's probably the biggest chunk. But I'll read a little bit during the day, on my break or, a break or something like that. The problem is that the phone and the internet has sort of taken that over, that it's easy just to flip open your phone and look at that for 5 minutes while you have a moment or something like that. Whereas I used to bring a book. I still bring a book with me everywhere I go. So I'll read books when I'm standing in line somewhere. And I often look, when you're standing at the DMV, you look kind of awkward being the only person reading a book standing there, but I will do that. So it's surprising how much, if you read, to think about that, if you read, 10 minutes here, 10 minutes there, and you did that 6 times during the day, you'd get 30 pages read.
Right. There's just nothing like that feeling too of picking up a book and for whatever reason it grabs you and pulls you in, and then you just go on a journey, right? Like you transcend space and time, and then after a period of time you go, wow, I can't believe the day is gone. I've just been reading this book this entire time. I just love that feeling. And there's no other medium that gives me that feeling. I mean, I'll get lost in other stuff that I love, like movies or podcasts. But once I'm done, I feel kind of tired, right? I'm a bit drained. And typically after reading, I feel the opposite. I feel nourished.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Satiated. Yeah.
I miss having like a commute where I have to actually be like in Chicago, where I'd ride a bus for 25 minutes and then I was on an L for 25 minutes, because I got the most reading done when someone else was getting me to my destination. And I think about when I was a kid and how I wish I would have read more, like on the 2-week-long road trip we took across, the United States, and like how you could have gotten so much done during that time. But instead, I mastered Super Mario Land 2 on the Game Boy, which also, has its merits.
My famous thing was when I found out you were doing the Audible books, JJ. That made me happy because I'm going to tell some things I shouldn't be probably telling. So I won't mention the place that I worked, but I worked for a state agency in Minnesota. And my job was to deliver the mail to the different, we had satellite offices. So I took this van and I went to the different offices route.
So you were a mailman?
Kind
you
of.
Worked for the post office?
No.
Courier.
No, I was a courier.
It sounded like you just described the post office.
Yeah.
You see, what I would do is I worked for this state agency, and my job was I would deliver the mail.
Yeah. No, I would go down to the post office every day. And I would get the mail from the post office. I'd bring it back to our office and we'd sort it for all the people, all the departments in our building. And then I would take the mail to the different satellite offices. And I did that route twice a day. And back then we didn't have Audible and we didn't even have the internet really the way it is now. And so I would get from the company books on tape. I would get tapes, and I didn't even have a tape player in my truck that was part of the dashboard. I had bought a little handheld one that I put tapes inside to replace the battery kind of deal. And I would listen. I would get through a book a day just listening while I was driving. But then the other thing I would do is every stop, I'd sit in the van for 10 minutes and read for 10 minutes. And I had I had about 6 stops. So I would get, and then I'd read at lunch. So I was getting that year I read over 120 books. Well, I worked there for 5 years. So I got a lot of books read that time I worked there. I mean, I was working the whole time, but I was working hardcore. I'll put it that way the whole time. So, but yeah, I read a lot. And I love it. So I'd have 2. That's the other thing I always tell people. You can have more than one book going at a time. I probably have 6 books going at any given time, mostly nonfiction. I find it's hard to read novels, more than one novel at a time, unless it's something I'm teaching. Because I always reread the books as I'm teaching them. So I might have that. I might have, I'm reading Warriors Don't Cry right now. I'll have that going plus 3 or 4 other nonfiction books going at a time. Because a nonfiction book you can pick up at any time and reconnect with it because it's about a subject that, in a general sense, you don't lose the narrative thread. So
I love reading. There's a reason why the Book It program at Pizza Hut was so successful for so many years, and I don't know if they still do it, but they should. Kevin Kennedy
I still miss the Scholastic Book Fair. I wish we could still. I still want that. Do they still make that, Kevin? Or are the kids still getting the Scholastic Book Fair brochure?
Yeah. I don't know how it works, but yeah, they do it at all the elementary schools. I think in the middle schools too. They do a kind of thing in the high school, but it's not the same deal. But yeah.
I just love poring over that and seeing, Goosebumps, Boxcar Kids, Encyclopedia Brown, Calvin and Hobbes, and Garfield, and such a great feeling.
They do the deal where you come to your school and they'd have, all the books laid on the tables, and you knew your mom would be like, okay, you can get 2, and you'd walk around and you pick one up, but then you'd put it down because you weren't sure if that was the one, oh man, I always told my kids they'd get whatever they want, and so they ended up getting 5 or 6 books each because I thought, well, this is what they're going to read.
At my elementary school, they timed it perfectly because that was during parent-teacher conferences.
Yep.
So my parents would put my sister and I in the gym that was filled with all of the books, and we'd look at the books while they went to find out how amazing I was.
And then they come back to the gym, and you got a stack of 45 books, and they're like, okay.
Yep. And I remember my sister got The Stinky Cheese Man and Other Stories.
Oh, I forgot about The Stinky Cheese Man. Oh, I love The Stinky Cheese Man. Oh, man.
Speaking of those younger age books and stuff like that, one series that I read to my kids was Diary of a Wimpy Kid. That is a great series. That one I enjoyed very much as an adult. So there you go. Did you guys read those books?
No, I was too old, I think, for that series.
Oh, yeah. I hit them right at the right moment. And they loved them. And so we ended up reading almost all of them. They're still coming out, actually. That guy still writes them. You got into, what was the one that you had, JJ, that you really, Goosebumps? Was that the series that you really got into?
Oh, my God. In fact, as an adult, I'm slowly but surely trying to accumulate the entire Goosebumps collection.
Yeah.
I'd love for that to be up there because I also had an idea for another podcast that is I would read a Goosebumps book and then just do like a 20-minute review of each of them. It'd be perfect for people who don't want to do their book required reading. They should listen to these and go for it. But that's a series that gripped me as a kid. But I was like, it's weird. Tucker and I were old enough where Nancy Drew and the Hardy Boys were too old, for us. So they came up, essentially they're like, well, we need to come up with another mystery based series for young children. And so the Boxcar Kids were a series that I think we read a lot. I'm speaking for Tucker in this point.
Well, I had a couple books of Boxcar Kids, but I really didn't get into them very much. I was huge into Encyclopedia Brown.
Oh yes, I'm hoping. Oh, I love that series.
Yep, Encyclopedia Brown was my jam, but also Choose Your Own Adventure was a really killer series where because I would always like end up just taking the wrong steps and finding a gruesome end at the end of those books.
I can remember reading Encyclopedia Brown because Tucker, the mysteries were like 2 pages, weren't they? And then the solution be on the next page or something like that.
It wasn't necessarily 2 pages, but it was multiple mysteries a book. So yeah, there'd probably be at least 4 or 5, and then all of the answers were at the back of the book. And I pretty much never solved it. I was not a good detective.
And it was always some little. The clues were there, and you'd go back and reread and go, "Oh yeah, you did mention that." Oh yeah,
right. And the mysteries divided between 2 kinds because there were the mysteries he would solve over the dinner table that the police weren't able to figure out. So his dad, the chief. Yeah, his dad was the chief of police, I think, and he would come home and then he would, if there was a case they couldn't solve, he would lay it out, and then Encyclopedia Brown would close his eyes, and that's how he would do his deepest thinking. Right. Oh, and then he would come up with the answer. And then there was the ones of the Encyclopedia Brown Detective Agency where him and what was her name? Was it Sally? Yeah. His bodyguard.
There was the one bully in town. What was
Bugs Meany. Bugs Meany.
Oh my God.
Bugs Meany was always causing mischief. And then people, usually neighborhood kids, would come to the Encyclopedia Brown Detective Agency. And then they'd have to go and solve. Yeah. Yep. And I laid this down in a previous episode, but I was so into Encyclopedia Brown, and I was so obsessed with the sign on his door because the book always had an actual drawing of the sign in it, so you could see an actual picture. And so I recreated it as the Lucas Detective Agency and put it on my dad's front door of his house. And I never caught a case, not one case. And I was willing to work for free. You didn't have to pay me a quarter, but. Yeah.
I remember those. What grade were you when you read those, Tucker? Because that means I think it's 5th grade when I read those.
No, I was reading those in 2nd and 3rd grade because I took to reading really fast, and so once the floodgates were open, my parents were just throwing books at me, and so I think I was getting them done
in the school library, and there were like 10 of them or whatever it was, and they kept coming out with more back then. But I'd get one and I'd read it in 3 days, and then I'd go get the next one. I just went right through the series. I love those books.
I couldn't tell you what era they're supposed to take place in, though. I don't even know what year they were written in.
I think I want to say the 70s.
Okay.
I was a kid when those were still coming out. I don't know if I think I'm going to look it up right now. Those books, I'm so glad you mentioned those because JG, you mentioned Hardy Boys. I'd read a lot of Hardy Boys books. And they were great. But those were a little bit before me, and there were like 100 and some of them. And I read probably 60 of them. Okay, Encyclopedia Brown. These are redone ones. What's the guy's name? Donald Sobel. Sobel, ages 8 to 12. Yeah, that would have been right in that wheelhouse. 12 books in this series. This is 1985, but I know they came out before that because I was a kid.
Oh man, this is really tickling the collector's part of my brain because I haven't had, my old copies of that were long ago sold at some, garage sale or something. So I don't have any more of those on my shelf. And now that I'm hitting the thrift stores regularly when I can, I got to start looking for Encyclopedia Brown books. I got to start looking for Goosebumps books, JJ, because that sounds amazing. But the other one I want to really collect is the Berenstain Bears books. Because I was obsessed with their books, but also there was one book that their son made about dinosaurs that I was obsessed with in the 1st grade that I'm going to have to track down at some point.
It's funny you mentioned that, Tucker, because I thought to myself the other day, and I was trying to engage some people at work with, if they wrote Berenstain Bear books for adults these days, I would pick them up. They were always like the Berenstain Bears and Bad Manners, the Berenstain Bears and Too Much TV. But I want the Berenstain Bears and the Inherited 401k.
Berenstain Bears go to divorce court.
Right, exactly. The the Berenstain Bears understand or Berenstain Bears research inheritance tax.
Yeah. Brother Bear is addicted to methamphetamines.
Right, exactly.
Okay, so Tucker, I'm looking this up. Encyclopedia Brown, the first one came out in 1963. And then obviously
Whoa.
it was a hit, but then he wrote 29 of them, and he was
Okay.
writing them consistently up through the 80s. The last one was published posthumously 2012, so I don't know that he was writing them later in his looks they're going up through the 80s and then 2000, 2003, 2007, so they were still coming out. But I would have been right in that wheelhouse of the early to mid 70s when they came out. And those were really aimed at boys, young boys to become readers. Yep. And boy, did those books hit me, just like the Encyclopedia Brown did. I mean, the Hardy Boys did. Love those books.
So
if I remember correctly, that is the very first series of books that I just devoured. I was just so into it. Sorry to cut you off, JJ.
No, that's fine. It's interesting that you guys are talking about this because my favorite movie from 2020 was a movie called Kid Detective. That it's what would happen if Encyclopedia Brown grew up and still lived in this town and still wanted to be a detective.
Really?
Because when I watch this movie, I'm like, well, this is clearly like the beginning of the movie shows this kid running his own kid detective agency. So it's a ripoff of Encyclopedia Brown. But then when he has to actually solve a real murder case when he's in his like mid 30s, it is a phenomenal movie. I found myself so engaged during this movie. And it's funny too, but it made me nostalgic for Encyclopedia Brown.
Someone get Kevin Feige on the phone, because I would love like a crossover film of different kid detective agencies. Like if Encyclopedia Brown and Alex Mack and I'm trying to think of some other ones. I know that's a whole genre in and of itself is child detective agencies. Were the Animorphs detectives? I never got into their books. Were they detectives?
I didn't read any Animorphs books because it always freaked me out. I'm like, you're not a tiger.
That was just a step too far.
Also, there was like an episode where one of them animorphed into like a rat, and I said, "What if that was your powers?" Oh, don't worry, you guys, I can turn into a rat.
JJ, when you were in elementary school, did you guys have Battle of the Books?
What was that?
We did not. But I remember Lincoln Elementary, which was close to my house, had a deal where if the student body could read 500 books, like in the month of April, the principal would have to eat lunch on like the peak of the roof. And they did. And it made the paper, this picture of the principal with a table sitting on the roof having to eat his lunch.
So, at Horseman Elementary School, Kevin, I think, Kevin, if you can find a way to recreate this, I think you should. At Horseman, we had this event every year called Battle of the Books. And this was a massive event. And this was a thing that all the kids in the school looked forward to getting a chance to do, because it was the 5th graders and the 6th graders that participated in it, and which were the last 2 grades at our elementary school. And what happened, what it was both the 5th graders and the 6th graders had the exact same reading list that they had to do. And then the 5th graders, and they would each be divided up into teams of 4. So the 5th graders would all get divided up into teams of 4, and the 6th graders would. And then within their own grades, they would basically have a quiz show tournament style about these books. And then you would basically teams would get eliminated. And like the finals, the final event was the winning 5th grade team and the winning 6th grade team in the gym in front of the entire school. And it was a massive event every single year. And without fail, every single year, the 5th graders won. For some reason, the 5th graders would always bring their game. And I remember our 5th grade year, I can't remember who was on our team, but we won. And then we were all pumped about how we're going to be the first 6th grade team that we're going to be the first class that goes back-to-back winners in Battle of the Books. And we got smoked by the 5th graders that year.
So they came up with a list every year, and how many books are on the list?
Oh, if I can remember correctly, I think it was maybe 15 to 20.
Okay, and so did every kid in your team of 4 read all 20 books?
Yep. So basically the way for your team to win, everyone on your team had to be very well versed in all of the books because you would not know which book you were about to get a question on. And I'm trying to remember the format too, because I think I can't remember if it would be like, all right, Tucker, your question is, or if it was, hey, team, and then the team would have to confer. I really can't remember because I think you could help each other out. So I'm a little blurry on the details, but the teams that dominated were the ones where the kids took it seriously.
So did the school buy the books for you, or did you have to go out and get them yourselves, or did your team of each buy 5 books and pass them around, or what'd you guys do?
The schools provided the books. And so basically like there would be like a period of time where I can't remember all the specifics of how we would get through the readings, because then the tournament style thing would happen fairly quickly at the end of it. So like it would be reading throughout the year. And then towards the end of the year, we would have this massive event. So it made the kids go, okay, I know if I want to really compete and be successful at Battle of the Books, I'm going to need to read these. And there were prizes that came with it too. I can't remember what the prizes were, but it was incredibly motivating because all of the kids, all of us, you go through that elementary school every year, you remember watching the big kids do this and how big of an event it was. So we were always super stoked to do it. And man, if no one is doing that in schools these days, bring that back, because boy, did that motivate us to read.
We started when I was at the Catholic school. Me, the librarian, and another English teacher started what we called the BBC, the Breakfast Book Club, and we became an official club in the school. And we got a grant from the Mothers Club at that school. And what it was we did it 4 times a year, so once each quarter, and we would meet at 5 a.m. usually on a Friday, 5 a.m. in the morning. And I would run to the bagel shop and I would get bagels for everybody. And the Mothers Club would pay for up to 30 books. And the kids would go into the library, they'd get a book and they get to keep it. And we would, you'd read the book and we have a book discussion, and we'd start out usually in tables. But it was amazing because there were books, sometimes we'd have 60 people show up and we didn't have books for everybody. They're like, oh, I'll just get my own copy. And it's weird how you can motivate kids to, the kids really wanted them. Can we let her in book club? I was like, I don't know how that would work, but I like stuff like that gets the kids motivated. And that's when we did one of the Harry Potter books. All the kids were like, well, let's read a Harry Potter book. I'm like, we let the kids recommend them, so the kids would say, I really think this book is good. So we do classics too. What's the foundation?
It's almost like kids have to be taught not to read, right? Like their natural inclination is, once they discover it, is as long as you nurture it, is to do that. But not reading is a learned behavior.
Yeah, and a lot of it unfortunately happens in middle school and high school when kids are required to read a certain book and it doesn't speak to them. But the problem is, if everybody's reading a different book, how do you assess that? And you always get the kid that didn't read it but read Spark Notes or something and can kind of scam by. It's a tough thing to sort of monitor. But I like that idea of Battle of the Books. That sounds great.
Yeah, I think that there have been some really creative educators in our neck of the woods over the years that have really put together some fascinating ways to get kids engaged with what they're doing and get them excited. And if it has to be a competition, let it be a competition and we'll all enjoy it. Kevin, I tried to wrap this episode up 38 minutes ago. So now is when we should actually wrap it up. But clearly we got a lot to talk about. I am sure we'll have you on for another book club episode in the not too distant future. Thank you so much for giving us some time and inspiring us to go and read some more stuff. I'm going to pick up a Steinbeck today, I think.
Oh, gosh. Yeah. You've read read up East of Eden. East of Eden's great. Oh, love that.
Not to be confused with the S&M movie Exit to Eden starring Rosie O'Donnell and Dan Aykroyd. I will not accidentally pick up the shooting script to that. That's going to wrap it up for today's show. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to help us continue to produce new episodes each week, visit jjmeetsworld.com, where you can donate to our Patreon, pick up some swag at the merch shop, or follow our link to Apple Podcasts and leave us a 5-star review. You can also follow us on social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, all the sites the cool kids are using these days. JJ Meets World is produced every week by Tucker Lucas. You can find out more about Tucker's work by visiting moonbasemaria.com. If you want to get in touch with your host with the most, check out linebenders.com, where you can find direct contact info for JJ or booking information. One thing I didn't like about Encyclopedia Brown is his dad should have been fired.